Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you part 2 of this comparison series looking at camera and specifically sensor performance between the tried and true Canon 5D Mark IV and the new Sony a7R3. And so in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at dynamic range. And of course, this was an area where, for example, when the a7R Mark II was introduced and still being compared to Canon cameras of a previous generation where it kind of blew Canon out of the water. The 5D Mark IV was a pretty huge step in the right direction for Canon, although we found that when we did the comparison series to the D850, that while it is close at and roughly similar at less extreme underexposing or overexposed areas, that in the absolute kind of 4-stop and beyond highlight or shadow pushes, the D850 is still superior. We'll find out how the a7R3 does in this metric as well. So in this episode today, we're going to take a look both at what happens when you underexpose images by 1, 2, 3, and 4 stops, and then also what happens when you overexpose them by the same number of stops. And we'll see how successfully you can recover shadow information, and then how successfully you can recover highlight information. And that should give you a good idea of how this is going to play out in real-world shooting situations when you're trying to either draw up shadows in areas maybe in your foreground if you're a landscape shooter, or recovering sky information if you are trying to recover on the other end. And so let's jump in and let's see how these two cameras compare. Okay, so first let's take a look at, this is base ISO 100, and this is our base exposure. 1/30th of a second f4. This is using the Zeiss Milvus 135mm f2 lens. And so what we're going to do now is that we're going to see how the camera handles underexposing the image here. And so here we'll take a quick look at our shadows at base ISO. Of course, everything is very, very smooth, looks fantastic. So now what we have done is we have underexposed one stop on the left side, and so you can see it looks a little bit dim. And on the right side, all I've done is I've dialed back in one stop of exposure, and so this is kind of a shadow recovery with one stop. And so let's say you underexposed by one stop, and so you didn't quite nail your shot. What kind of penalty would you be paying for that? And so as we look here, we see that the answer is that you would be paying very little. There's a little, the shadows are not quite as inky black here, but you can see that we've managed to raise up shadow information, and we haven't really added noise anywhere at all. Everything still looks really nice and clean. Looking over here, everything looks good. You've restored lost information, and you've done it really without much of any penalty. If we look at the colors here, everything is still looking pretty clean, and so no real issues there. So what happens now if we underexpose by 2 stops instead, and then we bring those 2 stops back? And so just take a look at this globally, then we'll compare the 1 stop underexposure and the 2 stop underexposure recovery. And so you've missed by 2 stops. What's that going to cost you in terms of shadow recovery? Well, if we look comparing the left to the right, we can see that there is the finest bit more of shadow noise that is there. It's mostly just in the form of what you might call grain pixel noise, not any kind of discoloration. And for example, if we look here inside the actual, inside the camera itself, we're not really seeing any really additional noise. Let's take a look over here on this side, and everything still looks nice and dark and clean. No real extra noise information introduced. Looking over here at color information, you might see the finest bit more of some color noise there, but it is still so mild as to be only detectable if you're putting the 2 images side by side. All right, so what happens if you've missed and underexposed by 3 stops? As you can see, our image is starting to get really dim, but here we've dialed back in 3 stops of exposure, and looking at the image globally, it still holds up remarkably well. So if we compare our 2-stop recovery on the left with our 3-stop recovery on the right, what are we going to find here? We're looking at this area here. We can see that, yeah, there is a little bit more pixel noise that has been introduced. You can also see a bit more in this color here. But, you know, really, all things considered, it's still looking pretty clean there in our actually kind of inky level. We'll take a peek inside the camera here, and, you know, if anything, it doesn't really look any different to me. Very similar on that side, and so looking over here as well, our you know, our 3-stop recovery hasn't really cost us any more than what our 2-stop recovery has, and in some ways I would say that there is less difference between the 2 and the 3-stop result than there was necessarily between the 1 and the 2-stop recovery. Okay, so let's say you really blew it. You've underexposed here by 4 stops. There's not a whole lot of information left here. Now on the right, we've dialed that exposure back in, and once again, look at the image globally. There's really not a huge penalty here. I'm not really seeing any kind of color banding on a global level that's been introduced. Colors still look pretty good, and so pretty impressive there. So if we can compare our 3-stop recovery on the left to our 4-stop recovery on the right, we can see that, yes, we have added in a little bit more noise in terms of the roughness of the pixels. I can also see just a little bit of a color banding right at that transition there. Looking into the actual black area, you can see that the pixel, you know, kind of roughness is a little bit more obvious. And if we come down here and take a look, you can see that, you know, the recovery has produced a little bit rougher, not quite as smooth result with these 4 stops. And you can also see a little bit in this area that there is some discoloration. However, it's still not all that extreme, and you can see it show up in some of the transition areas. But, you know, really, all things considered, we've still got a pretty strong result here for a 4-stop recovery. Looking into our color information here, yes, the pixels themselves look a little bit rougher, but at the same time, the color rendition is held up quite well. So what happens if we compare our recovered 4-stop underexposure result with our baseline image on the left? Well, obviously we would expect, if we look into the out of focus area, that the left is going to be smoother, and it certainly is. There's not really any apparent pixel information there, while there is some roughness here. But if we kind of scroll through this, I'm not really seeing any kind of strong color banding in the shadows, and so that certainly is impressive. If we are to look into this area of the image, you know, you can see a bit of a difference, but at the same time, it's not strongly pronounced here. And looking down into this area of the image here, you know, there's minor variances in our focus, but our results really are not highly different. The biggest difference I think you're going to see is just in the basic roughness of the pixels. There is the, you know, the most minute amount of color banding that is introduced at areas of transition. But all in all, I'm really quite impressed by how good that result looks for having been recovered so much. Now, how do these results compare to the Canon? And so looking at our, you know, base level, we would expect that, you know, all settings being equal, that these images are going to look, you know, pretty similar, other than what we have discussed in another episode. We've talked about color science, and so the Canon color is a little bit different than the Sony color, but we're looking more at just the, you know, the appearance of noise. And as we can see, you know, both of these cameras look very good at base ISO, no apparent noise, none that we would expect. Now, if we compare the 1-stop recovery here, we can see that neither one of these cameras has introduced any kind of color banding in that area. Looking at our, you know, just kind of area that should be, you know, consistent color, we see that it is on both of them. I'm not expecting to see any kind of real impact here, and of course I'm not seeing one if we look in this area here at just, you know, the color information and that transition zone that we looked at before. Both of them look nice and clean. Now in our 2-stop recovery here, we can see that still both of them look pretty much similar. They're nice and even in the you know, kind of area that should be completely black back there. Looking at this transition area, of course, we didn't see any fringing on the Sony as we walk through this. We're not seeing any on the Canon as well. Looking at the amount of, you know, kind of the pixel roughness and how colors are holding up, they look, at this stage, they look roughly equal to me. In this area here, we're not really seeing any color banding on either one of them. And the Canon is holding up nicely with the two-stop transition here without any kind of real impact for recovering that shadow information. Now, if we compare a three-stop result, what we are seeing is it's very faint, but we can see a little bit of noise patterning in the area that should be a consistently smooth, and it's just more obvious on the Canon than it is on the Sony. The Sony at this stage, I think, is handling that a little bit better. Now, in terms of the roughness of the pixels, I don't think, of course, there's more pixels on the Sony than there is on the Canon, but at the same time, I am not seeing any extra roughness of pixels. Both of them look roughly equal, which in some ways is very close to a win for Sony, just because there are more pixels there. Both of them are still holding up nice and smooth as far as that, but we have seen that up in this area here there is, which tells us that in the image overall there is just a little bit of some color banding that's taking place. But at the same time, kudos to both companies. A three-stop recovery looks pretty great. Okay, now finally with a four-stop recovery. And this is where I think that really for Canon shooters, 3 stops of underexposure, not to say it's your absolute limit, but that's where it's after that you really start to pay a price. And as you can see, there are some vertical striations here that aren't really apparent in the Sony result, and definitely some brighter magenta coloration that's showing up. And that also shows up here where you can see some magenta patterning. There is a little bit of green patterning in the Sony, which reminds me a little bit of the result from the Nikon D850 in terms of those biases. But if we look inside here, the Sony is much more neutral, whereas you can see some magenta bleed through that's taking place on the Canon. And so it's at the 4-stop range where I think that Canon starts to take a hit here. And so it's not to say that it's not usable, it's just it's not as usable maybe as what the Sony result is, and so as a result, it's just going to impact colors a little bit too, that may be a little bit less consistent with the Canon now as they were with on the Sony result. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to push things the opposite direction. Of course, dynamic range is not just shadow recovery, it's highlight recovery. And so here we have overexposed by 1 stop, and then on the right side we have drawn that back down. So in this case, we're mostly looking at areas where you could have hot spots. You could lose information due to being blown out. And so it's going to affect the bright areas here the most. And so here, for example, we have seen that we're able to pull that back around some of this color area here. We pull in that hot spot, and there's not really any true hot spots that are here. We're able to bring that down without any kind of loss of information at this point. Now in this case, we've overexposed by 2 stops. We've brought it back down on the right, and so we can see, looking globally at the image, that it's held up just fine. So if we compare our 1-stop recovery on the left and our 2-stop recovery on the right, we can see that it's handled this just fine. For example, this area here, it's still recovered that fine. If we look in kind of the transition here around the letters and this area that gets completely washed out, we can see that that is held up fine also. Looking at the front fascia of the camera body itself, we can also see here that we haven't lost any information yet. Now, if we overexpose by 3 stops, things start to get a little bit rougher to recover. However, if we look at the image globally, there are a few hot spots here, but the image as a whole doesn't look too bad. But if we look at kind of a few of our key spots, we're going to see, for example, this area hasn't fully recovered. We can also see that this area here hasn't fully recovered. There's a bit of an issue there as well. So if we compare our 2-stop recovery and our 3-stop recovery, we can see how that there are a few areas where we have started to lose some information, and this has held up okay. You can see just the faintest outline from recovery, but here you can see that we've definitely got a pretty big hot spot that has emerged. Now finally, if we examine the 4-stop overexposure, we can see that we have exposed beyond our ability to adequately recover. It doesn't look natural. It doesn't look close any longer. We've completely lost the front fascia of the camera, completely blown out all the detail there. And on our case here, we've just seen everything's pretty much become a mess there. And so there's your, your upper limits of what's possible. So if you can compare Sony and Canon with the one-stop overexposure and recovery, we can see that both cameras have done fine here, looking at them globally. And certainly, for example, on our spot here, everything is held up fine. If we look at the face here, there's no kind of weird edges, no hot spot that has remained. So both of them doing fine at a one-stop recovery. Now at a two-stop recovery, we are still, looking fairly similar here. Both of them have recovered our, kind of blown out areas that are prone. And if we look here, the Canon shows maybe just the slightest bit less of an outline here. The hot spot, I think, is a little bit more obvious on the Sony than it is on the Canon, which frankly is surprising, as the Sony is rated a little bit higher when it comes to the dynamic range. Now at our three-stop recovery, I think that here's where the edge for the Sony starts to come in. For example, if you look in this area here, the Sony, while it's starting to lose information too, the Canon is losing more. And so that's the beginning of the kind of true erosion here. And also if we look over at this area here, both of them are, quite blown out at this point. So in the extremes, they're kind of equal. But if we look, for example, at an area like these hot spots, the Sony is hanging on to just a little bit more than what the Canon is, though not by a huge margin. Now with either of these, if you overexpose by 4 stops, you're done. The image is just not going to be recoverable. You're not going to recover sky that is at that kind of extreme. That gives you the practical limits of the dynamic range. And so as you can see, the Sony in some areas is a little bit better, but it really shows up more at the extremes. So in many ways, the results that I saw here remind me a lot of when I did the comparison with the Nikon D850. And in a lot of ways, I think that the D850 and the A7R3 deliver roughly similar results. And of course, without comparing them side by side, it'd be hard for me to know which gives any kind of edge. But certainly these two cameras, I believe, are right now the best of the current bunch when it comes to the dynamic range. Now we saw with the Canon 5D Mark IV that it's not as good at the extremes. And on the underexposure end, basically somewhere between 3 stops of underexposure and 4 stops, the Canon starts to fade when compared to the Sony a7R3. And while in our first episode, when we looked at color science, we determined that Canon does have an advantage when it comes to the color science there. But of course, when you're pushing at the extremes, you may get a little bit better result from the Sony in that regard. Now, when we looked at overexposure, both of the cameras didn't last as long, and a 4-stop of underexposure results are still very, very clean with the a7R3. But already by 3 stops of overexposure, you're starting to see, some ragged edges start to appear. And of course, by 4 stops, there is a slight advantage for the Sony, but it's really a moot point because both of them are unusable by 4 stops of overexposure. And so I would say that you can very successfully recover 4 stops of underexposure on the a7R3, but your limit is somewhere between 2 and 3 stops of overexposure before you start to develop hot spots. And with the Canon, you can really successfully recover more like 3 stops of underexposure before you're going to start to see some color banding issues. And again, somewhere between 2 and 3 stops of overexposure before you basically start to fall apart. Now, the reality for a lot of shooters is that unless you are specifically shooting very, very high contrast scenes that really need a lot of dynamic range. The reality is that for most shooters who actually know how to shoot and get shots reasonably right, you're going to have enough latitude, I think, for recovering from both of these cameras. And after having shot with the 5D Mark IV for a year and a half at this point, I found a huge advantage over previous generation Canon cameras when it comes to just kind of general recovery. And I also find that I resort already to shooting HDR type images or bracketing exposures. I resort to that far less often because frankly it's really not all that necessary. So that's even a little bit more true when you're talking about the Sony a7R3, which really is a pretty fantastic landscape camera, for example. I'm Dustin Abbott, and stay tuned as we continue on with this comparison series. And in future episodes, we'll be covering ISO performance from both of these cameras. We'll look at resolution and how that additional 12 megapixels of information on the a7R3, what kind of advantages that gives it. And so stay tuned for these and future episodes as I continue my ongoing coverage of the Sony a7R3. If you haven't already, of course, you can become a subscriber here, and I will be sharing some of these raw files for my patrons. And so if you would like to join and become a supporter there at Patreon, you certainly can have access to those things. And I want to say thank you to those of you who are already supporting this channel in that way. And of course, thanks for watching today. Have a great day.